Today, I'd like to welcome really a true legacy figure for my life, somebody who's taught me so much, Soonkeum Cox, who carries with her, both personally and professionally, a perspective on international adoption that really nobody else we've talked to in this series has been able to bring to us. So I'm absolutely thrilled to reconnect with you. It's been many years.
Too
And
long, too long.
it's been too long. And now that we're both retired, although I'm not really retired, and obviously you're not really,
Right.
I guess people in the field never really retire because
I think you're right. I
yeah,
think you're
our,
correct.
our passions continue no matter what,
Mhm.
paid or not. Just really happy to have you with us today.
Thank you. My pleasure.
There's so many things I could ask you, and we're going to have your resume available. So I'm going to give you the opportunity to talk about the kinds of things you'd like the viewing audience to most know about you. What do you bring forward in
Sure,
the legacy series?
sure. Well, to begin with, when we first met so many years ago, I was really focused on international adoption, both professionally and personally. And that was really the introduction for me, and then later on the board of NACAC, to be involved with adoption and child welfare more broadly. And what I've always believed is true is that there's so much that's similar. I mean, the uniqueness of being a different race than your parents, being born in another country, coming with a different history, all of that is certainly unique to international adoption. But the feelings, the connection, all of the things that are both challenging and joyful about adoption I think it transcends that. And so that was a real gift to be able to go on into my international work knowing that. So many times when you talk about permanency, there is sort of a two-tier process. What we do in the US as best practice in terms of protecting and making sure birth mothers have the opportunity to be a part of the process, make the decisions that they want. And in other countries, sometimes that is ignored. It's more of a process where, to me, adoption should always be finding families for children, not children for families. And there are times that in any adoption, I think that gets minimized or it's not as obvious. But I know there have been times when there have been wrongful adoption cases and children that's been a issue with the birth parents, the adopted parents, and of course the adoptee. And they seem to be resolved differently internationally than domestically. And so that's one of the inequities that I think has troubled me. I think it's improving, but certainly that's one of the differences that I saw from the beginning. I was adopted in 1956. So when you say legacy, it means I'm the oldest intercountry adoptee on the planet, it seems like. But for years, I really was the only adoption professional. And I felt like an island so many times. And now that is a very robust group of professionals that are doing wonderful work. And they also happen to be adopted and international adoptees. And so that is a huge shift from when I first began. I think that I was involved long enough to see some really transformational changes that happened. I was in my early 20s when I first went to work at Holt. I was on the board first and then went to work there. So from about 1976 on, I had a ongoing relationship with Holt, either as board or staff. And so much has changed. And I certainly have the most experience with Korea, but things that we didn't even think about in the 50s when they first started placing kids for adoption. At that point, it was right after the war. It was a matter of survival for those kids. And so I've always felt that intercountry adoption from Korea, I mean, Sharon, it really just split wide open the idea of secrecy in adoption. You could not pretend as a Caucasian couple that this Korean child was a child you'd given birth to. So I think that was a huge accomplishment just with that. But in the beginning, the idea was the worry was how do we make sure that these children become acclimated, in the US, Americanized, if it was Denmark, become Danish, whatever the nationality was of the family. And so, because that was given so much attention or concern, the whole idea of staying connected to your culture and heritage, that was not learned until later. That was not given priority until later. And it's because no one knew. I mean, they were inventing it as it happened. So I sometimes get a little bit, well, now that I'm retired, I can say whatever word I want. So sometimes I get, frankly, irritated or impatient with this. The world is not black and white. And I consider myself sort of a militant moderate. And when you look at something in an extreme, in any direction on any subject, it's just not going to be productive. It doesn't get you where you want to go. So were there things that were not done properly or that needed to change when they first started intercountry adoption or adoption generally? Of course. And I think that I've been able to experience and observe and see many of those changes. Now, does it mean it's perfect? Of course it doesn't. But I feel like sometimes when I speak with adopted parents who say tearfully and apologetically that they worry that they did the wrong thing to adopt from another country. And that makes me so sad because you assume that the adoption was done properly, that it was done ethically, that it was done in a way that protects the child, the birth family, and the adoptive family, that the child would not have had an opportunity for a family without adoption. And so when that is the situation, I think that is a positive thing. Is it bittersweet? Of course it is. But to just blanketly hear statements that adoption is baby buying, I don't accept that. And that's the reason that I've always been so determined that the Hague Convention on Intercountry Adoption was critical because it put in place really minimal standards, but it was international. It's something that was agreed to. And so, that happened, years and years later. But when you think about the impact that has had in terms of, for example, if you are adopt a placing agency in the US, you have to be accredited. You can no longer just say, gee, I'd like to place children. I'd like to be an international adoption agency. And that's the way it used to be. Wow. And so that's a huge step forward. So, there's a number of things. And then certainly the attention to culture and heritage. I see that as profoundly important. And I consider that I didn't leave Korea to go to America. I left Korea to go to a family. And I think that's a distinction that is really important to me. And having searched for and been reunited with my biological family, everything that I always had expected or suspected around the circumstances of my adoption were in fact true. And my mother had a very sad life. It was a sacrifice, I believe, for her to have chosen adoption for me. It wasn't a choice that, she had someone else take me to the orphanage because she simply couldn't. And she named me. And my Korean name means pure gold.
Mm.
I can't tell you what a treasure that is to know that in her mind, that's how she thought and considered me. So having the comparison of what my life would have been like in Korea. And it's not that, I would have been in a very poor circumstance. It's not that so much as the fact that I wouldn't have had a family. And so I was just in Korea a couple of weeks ago and went to the Holt Orphanage. And I went there for the first time when I was 26 years old. And I saw people in their 20s, my age. And I had been adopted and they hadn't. Our circumstance was so different. And as the years have gone by, I always try to go there when I'm in Korea, when I visit. And now we're the same age, we're in our 60s and 70s. And in a way, it's even more jarringly different because I had a family, I've been married, I have had a career, I have grandchildren, all of the things that have just been my life. And then here are these 60-year-old orphans with gray hair.
Wow.
So when you think about adoption and family, and you compare those two side by side, that's not a difficult choice for me to look at in terms of what was the right situation. And I also think there's this concern, rightfully so, that children who are adopted in another country, they lose their country and culture, they lose their heritage. And there is certainly, you're disconnected from it, but you can, as an adult, claim that in some way. And if you are a child growing up in an orphanage, you do not experience the rich country and culture of your birth country. You experience institutionalization. That's reality, and that's a very, very different thing. And Korea is criticized because, and rightfully so, that here they are, one of the largest economies in the world, and yet they're still placing children for adoption. Now, it's a very small number, but it's because children are being born and they're going into orphanages. They're not being adopted domestically. And so when you see beautiful babies and they were going to an orphanage, and just like our kids in foster care in the US, what comes out at the other end when they're 18 is not what you would want for someone.
Is that a cultural issue, Susan?
Yes,
So
it is.
those are unkeepable children for some
Well,
reason?
it is the whole idea of racial heritage and racial, ethnicity and purity. That is so strongly held in Korea, Japan, but in Korea so strongly. And Korea now has the lowest birth rate in the world.
Wow.
And so, that's a real concern of the South Korean government, is what's going to happen when children, there's no one moving up to replace the workforce as people get old and age out. And so, but somehow they've not been able to make that leap to looking at children. The stigma of orphan is so powerful, even now.
Now, I know Holt didn't just work with Korea, and
Right.
I'm curious.
That's right.
We've always had war that made orphans.
Mm-hmm.
So it does seem to me that that's been one of the feeders of international adoption.
Sure.
But there are also areas that have consistently been placing children where there isn't a war. You know,
Mhm.
what causes nations to consider placing
Mhm.
what I consider their most precious resource?
Right, right.
Why do countries do that?
I mean, a lot of it is poverty. It's the lack of acceptance of birth families, excuse me, of single mothers,
Ah,
the illegitimacy.
mhm.
I mean, Sharon, we both know that book, The Girls Who Went Away. We
Yes,
know that from our lifetime.
yes, yes,
So when I talk with my children or grandchildren, the concept of a single parent somehow being a negative thing, that is, they can't even comprehend that because it's always been an acceptable part of the culture that they grew up in. That
yeah,
isn't true in so many other countries. And poverty is very often, one of the reasons that children um, are put in orphanages and they are placed for adoption. And then, there's natural disasters. And this is a story about the differences or one of the nuances. Um, Remember the tsunami in Thailand? And of course, because we had a program in Thailand and people are seeing the images of children on the news, our phones were just, we're ringing off the hook of people. Oh my goodness, how can we help these children? Well, then the leap to, can we adopt them? Like somehow, I mean, intercountry adoption should never be the first line of defense, ever, ever. And so to leap to that first is just, it's wrong, it's unethical, it's impractical, all of those things. I remember talking to a journalist who said, so what's going to happen to those kids? And saying, well, it's a real tragedy what's happening. And right now it's important that everything be done to help secure the children's safety and along with everybody else. And then to determine where are they, are they orphans in terms of loss of parents and so on. And she's saying, well, wouldn't it be better if they just come here? And I said, no. I mean, first of all, the tsunami, the children would have been the first to perish because they didn't have this body strength. They wouldn't have been able to hang on. So it was children that were lost, certainly as much as adults. And I said, so if there was a earthquake in Los Angeles, imagine that. But thousands of children were displaced, hundreds of children were displaced. You would immediately begin to find their next of kin. You
mhm.
know, are they in South Carolina? Are they in Montana? But there's going to be aunts, cousins, family who will want to be able to take care of that child. And the conversation just went on. And I said, so imagine if instead of taking the time to reunite that child with a relative, or maybe there's no relative, but a neighbor, somehow making sure that child was safe in the environment where they grew up, instead of saying, you know what, let's send them all to Canada or let's send them to Mexico. I said, that's what you're saying should happen to these kids in Thailand. I'll never forget it. And she said, but they're over there.
Oh my.
And the idea that someone, well,
Well,
a journalist would,
yeah,
be thinking like that. But,
right.
but that's the reality. And so I always am conflicted on one hand that there shouldn't be barriers to children having families if the only family is through adoption. There should not be barriers for that to happen. However, it's not that any family is good enough. Those children deserve a the best family, and they may not look like them. They may be very different in so many ways. And I guess obviously I grew up with parents who didn't look like me. And I'm the oldest of five siblings, and three were biological to my parents.
Excuse
So
me.
didn't look like my siblings either. but the feelings, the connection, those emotions, those feelings, those connections, they were the same. And so that's what's reassuring to me about adoption.
I'm so sorry.
But adoption can transcend all of those challenges. But it requires work. I mean, it takes effort. And when parents, people will say, well, children who are adopted are not different than biological children. Well, maybe the children aren't different, but the circumstance is different. And that doesn't mean necessarily that it's bad, but it just is. And so all of the things that we didn't know about in 1950s,
Or
both
the
domestic adoption or international adoption. And I feel like, we're still learning. But to some of the adoptees who I see being very judgmental about the appropriateness of intercountry adoption, just generally, blanket statements of it's wrong and buying and selling babies. I wish there would be more grace. There isn't. I was in India. This was, many years ago, but went to South India, was visiting one of our programs there. And so going through the city streets, and on both sides of the street, there were these huge boulders that were the size of cars. And there were women, hot sun, and they had hammers and they were cutting those rocks, starting out the size of a car until they were gravel. So that was their life. That was their reality. And so we went to, past these women to the center to visit the whole center. And we had, there was a nursery program. There were a number of programs there, but also there was an unwed mothers program. So these two women, young, I would say early 20s at the oldest. And they were illiterate. They could only sign an X because they didn't even know how to write their name. And in this very modest little place where they were warm, they were safe, they had food, they had shelter. And as they both described, that was the most comfortable life they had ever experienced. But they could not keep those babies that they were going to give birth to, because if their family discovered they were pregnant, they'd be banished. And they could not have cared for those for those babies. I mean, they were going to have a very harsh life just on their own. And so I thought, I had just not long before found my birth family. And I thought, these women, these mothers are going to give birth to children. And they were both, placing their children for adoption. And I thought, someday those children grown up will likely want to, or maybe not, but may want to come back and find out their history, find their biological mother. And I thought, what would that be like for them? First of all, who knows in 20 years or 15 years what those women, what their life would be,
right,
or if they could survive that kind of life for so long. And I couldn't help but think there'd be, I can imagine you wouldn't feel some guilt for having had a much different life than your birth mother had. I certainly had those feelings myself, and they were not as dramatic as that. And it's complicated. It is complicated. It didn't mean, I mean, for those women, they were so relieved to know, and the one was quite direct in saying, not necessarily for her child, but for her, that she knew she couldn't keep the baby, that her life would be so hard and it would be impossible with that, would be a illegitimate child. So it's not easy, the reality for so many parts of the world.
One of the things I'm wondering about, because I've had people ask me about this, if they're considering international adoption, is what about the men? We've struggled in this country to begin to recognize that, we're made up of genetics from both a man and a woman.
Right.
What is done to involve the men, internationally? Are they present in the thought process at all?
Very often there is no man present, which is, part of the issue. Sometimes it is a couple that will relinquish, particularly if there is any kind of a disability
of the child.
Okay. Yes. A healthy child that's an orphan is difficult, but a child with a disability, those are children that are, still not accepted easily. It's improving, it's getting better. And sometimes the family doesn't have the resources to be able to provide the surgery or whatever the situation is that the children need. But still, it's mostly the women. I mean, obviously there are occasions when that isn't true, but as it is here, very often it's kind of a solo process.
So unlike here, where we have to somehow figure out how to find that man, if possible, and have him accept, that's not a part of the process internationally.
It depends on the country. It depends. I mean, there has to be, they have to demonstrate that there are, the child is abandoned, or that there are efforts there. I mean, to certainly identify what the situation is, do what they can to get at least a signature, not so different from here. I think about it in terms of go back a generation or two to what we had here in the US. And I think sometimes we get pretty high-minded about ourselves and how much better we are the way we do things. But in reality, it hasn't been that long. We match children. That word is because we match them. We try to pretend that this is a child that so closely looks like the adopted parents that they don't have to acknowledge that they are adopted.
The other thing I'm curious about, we've moved into so much openness here, which for me is the greatest benefit for siblings. Maybe siblings who come after, whatever. Have you seen any movement internationally towards keeping enough information for people to stay connected, or at least to know that there are siblings?
Well, I mean, they try. I would say there's certainly efforts to not separate siblings. I mean, that is not a acceptable practice. I mean, in the beginning, I mean, certainly for years that wasn't considered a priority. It wasn't understood to be important. But one of the 23andMe, or the DNA matching, that has made a huge difference in the ability of search and reunion, and not just on the adoptee side, also, from the birth parents. in Korea, and I believe some other countries, they have television shows where an adoptee can go on and say, my name is Hong Soonkeum. I was born in 19 umpty ump, and I'm searching for my birth family. And also birth family can go on television and say, we gave up a child, birth date, so it's mostly adoptees who are doing the searching, publicly like that. But there have been a number of reunions because of DNA matching. And also, you can certainly identify markers quite a ways down the family tree, but adoptees who have found cousins, siblings, and some of them are pretty removed. Someone, I don't know, called and told me they were all excited because they'd found a cousin that was like, I don't know, 34 generate, and I thought, whoa, that's a long way.
Right.
But again, it's that longing for connection. It's the who do I look like? Who am I? That's all. That hasn't changed. There are things, technology and like the DNA matching, that is going to make it easier for the searching to happen. But when you say people ask you about adoption, one of the things that I always make very clear to someone that's considering international adoption is that if you are doing this because you think you are avoiding a birth mother or birth family coming into the picture, first of all, that's wrong, most importantly. But secondly, there are no guarantees. You can no longer say, gee, no one's ever going to know. No one can ever find out. People know in real time things that are happening. And so, to begin with, that should not be a motivation. And if it is, they've got some serious things to work through. But even if they, just to think about the fact that it's a very different world in terms of technology and connections, it's a whole different place.
Even language,
For the good and bad, yeah.
Yeah, and even language, which I know was
Mhm.
an impediment for many, and now
Right,
you literally can carry your phone and put in a
right,
language translator, and
sure,
the next thing
sure,
you know is you're having a dialogue, and that's
right, right,
a new experience for many folks I've met as well.
right.
Two quickies before I ask you some personal questions. One of them is, has The Hague addressed the two things I hear most worrisome from people when they talk about international, and that is baby selling, which you touched on, and trafficking of children for sexual purposes. Has any of that been addressed by The Hague? I'm asking here for our viewers who
Sure,
are concerned about those two issues.
sure, sure. Well, first of all, am I saying there is never any trafficking with adoption? That, of course, I can't say that.
Mhm.
However, one of the things that has been so important is that an agency has to go through a very rigorous process to be accredited. And that isn't accreditation for life. I mean, it is ongoing. You have to, I think, renew every 2 or 4 years. And part of that accreditation is including who are you working with in the other country.
Uh-huh.
So you have to be able to, I guess, speak for, you have to be able to identify, but also to say, this is who we're working with. I mean, the process is much more rigorous. And then there is the other protection is there are two central authorities. In the US, it's the State Department, but in the other countries, there is a central authority. And so there's just a whole lot more protection built in. So when they say, is there trafficking? There is probably trafficking that's happening, country adoption.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. That's very helpful. What would you say are the ways that, having been adopted internationally, have affected your life, your perspective on life?
Mm. Well, I wouldn't have had a family. And then from there, all the experiences that provided. And I feel like I'm much more of a global citizen. And part of it is because I've been able to, in my work, visit a number of different countries that is unusual. I mean, I think not typical of other adoptees necessarily, but it has certainly given me a perspective of how the world is different in other places. I realize certainly how different my life would have been, and not because I wouldn't have had opportunities as much as I simply wouldn't have had. I would have had the stigma of orphan all the way through adulthood. So that doesn't really go away. So, I mean, that is, that's very, that's right out there. But then also, the ability to, just be this girl who grew up in rural Oregon and just, have been a wife and a sister, an aunt, a mother, a grandmother. None of those things that would have been possible if I hadn't been adopted. Now, I don't want to romanticize adoption in the same way that families are complicated. I mean, families are imperfect. Humans are imperfect. And there have been some dreadful adoptions. I mean, there just has been. But there also, that happens domestically. That's not an excuse. And also, there's some pretty dreadful things that happen in families, which is why, children are removed from their families and go into foster care. So I guess I think of the progress that's been made, and I grew up looking different than my parents. And when I gave birth to my first child, I'm thinking, oh, finally I'll have someone who looks like me. And so I have a son and daughter. And the irony is that they kind of look like me, but they don't look Korean, which is, that was a surprise to me. And, a bit of a disappointment. However, one of my grandsons looks much more Asian than, his father does. But I've been able to embrace my culture and heritage as an adult. I didn't know how to do. I mean, there was no way in little Brownsville, Oregon, that was happening. And I didn't know to do it with my children. That's something that's happened. I mean, my kids are almost 50. So that was certainly early on in the process. But have been able to experience doing that with my grandchildren, because my children identify with the Korean part of them in a way that I find very satisfying. And so even though it has, diminished by every generation, I'm half Korean, so my children are quarter, their children are eighth. And so as the generations pass, it will get dimmer and dimmer in their bloodline. Right. But in our family history, in our legacy, in who we, in our family lineage, Korea is going to go on into generations that follow. I find that very satisfying.
My goodness, thank you. Do you have any final thoughts? I mean, really important things you want people to carry away from this interview?
I guess, I mean, I have been concerned about this very strong anti-intercountry adoption sentiment.
Okay.
And I feel like when you've met one adoptee, you've met one adoptee. And of course, there are huge variants in the way people think and their philosophy, how they live life, all of those things. But yet, to just for there to be this harsh line of demarcation that intercountry adoption is trafficking.
Mm.
I find that unfair. I find it disappointing. And I find it a concern because I think that there will be children who suffer because of that, who won't have families. And so it's one thing to be critical of things that need to improve and to work towards making that better. But to just blanketly say, this is what is, I don't think that's fair. And it doesn't make it better. And I can't help but think about the experiences that I've just described. And when people say that intercountry adoption should stop immediately, I go to compared to what?
Mm-hmm.
Compared to what? And if it is a family or an institution, to me, that's not an easy question to just say nothing more.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Your
Sharon.
passion, your knowledge, your caring comes through so loud and clear. It's really a privilege to connect with you and be able to talk
Yes.
to you. I thank you so much for the interview.
Thank you, Sharon.